Hello, welcome to our question and answer session on Google's most searched terms for IR35. You may recall we did a similar session last year. Obviously, we've had a 12-month delay in the rollout of the changes, so it'll be interesting to see what questions Google is being asked now compared to last time round. My name is Matt Fryer. I'm Group Compliance Director at Brooks & Group, and I also head up our legal services practice. We spent the last 12-18 months working with lots of end hirers, agencies and contractors, trying to get the implementation of these changes right. And I think the questions that are being asked of Google will help us all to get a head around what the changes are and what we need to do. Happy to be joined on this session by Paul Lloyd. Paul, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Paul Lloyd. I'm the Group Sales Director for Brookson. Lots of experience in talking about IR35 and helping agencies and clients through the changes in the public sector and prior to the delay to April 2020. We're giving lots of advice to clients around IR35 then as well.
Great, thanks Paul. So we've got a list of, there's 10 or 12 questions here. We haven't seen them yet, so we'll see how we get on. So the first section we're going to look at is questions beginning what relating to IR35. And Paul's going to see the question in a second and read it out, and I'll have a go at answering.
The first question, Matt, is what impact has COVID had on IR35?
Question. So I guess we look at the delay to the rollout to April 21. The reason government gave for that is because businesses are obviously going to struggle over the next 12 months to implement a big business change against the backdrop of the COVID pandemic. So that's big impact one. That's one of the key reasons why everyone's given an extra 12 months to get ready. Be interesting to see the impact COVID has on the economy. Feels like there's a recession coming. The ability for businesses to flex their workforce during that period is be important as well. So we might see a growing use in off-payroll workers. So a growing stress in businesses around managing this new risk from April 21.
Okay, the second question, Matt, is what happens to IR35 after April 2021?
So the main change is the responsibility shift. So responsibility for determining status moves from the personal service company, from the contractor, directly to the end client now who benefits from that contractor service. So that's the big change, and hirers have got to make an IR35 decision. We also see tax risk moving as well. Currently it sits with a contractor, but that's going to sit in two places, one with the end client. If they don't take reasonable care in coming to that status determination, they potentially got tax risk. Also the fee payer, typically the recruitment agency that's paying the contractor, they've got some tax risk involved here as well. So it's really important that end hirers and recruitment agencies start to get their head around this change and thinking through what their process is going to be in the run-up to April 21, and not forgetting that this is a continuing risk to manage after that date as well.
Brilliant. And the third question is what IR35 tools are available?
Okay, yeah, it's an interesting question, that one. Lots of tools in the market now. The main one, so by tool I'm referring to an algorithm-based online tool that gives an automated IR35 status decision. So there is one out there, it's free to use, it's available on the government's website called CEST. Lots of concern around the accuracy of that and the way that a computer algorithm can give an IR35 decision. There are other private sector developed tools out there. Obviously, you've got to pay for those. Still concerns around that mechanistic approach. The courts have said that that's not the way you assess status. You need to look at all the factors, sit back and come to a decision. So lots of tools out there, some better than others. I'm not convinced that any of them give you that non-mechanistic approach to status decision making that the courts require. So I guess there's a word of warning attached to those. Think carefully before using them.
Brilliant, thanks Matt.
Okay, so in this section I'm going to be grilling Paul on will IR35 based questions. Let's take the first one. So Paul, will IR35 be delayed again?
That's a good question, and something I get asked quite regularly. I think it's highly unlikely is probably the most obvious answer. HMRC were keen to introduce this in April 2020. There is extremely large tax savings they're budgeted for, and the delay due to COVID really has meant that the 12-month soft landing that was originally spoke about now means that it's still coming in as a hard landing in April 2021. So I think any businesses that think that this is going to be delayed are going to have a shock come next year and need to start preparing earlier rather than later.
Will companies blanket ban IR35?
More than likely, yeah, I suppose is the answer. We definitely saw that in the public sector changes in 2017. We saw it in the run-up to the changes before they got delayed for April 2020. And I suppose that companies may look to do that because it's easier for them. I suppose the obvious point is that they're going to find it extremely difficult to attract talent. It's not taking reasonable care in terms of making sure they've done a correct assessment in terms of IR35. And I think what we found on the run-up to April 2020 was that it resulted in a lot of disgruntled contractors, a lot of them asking for rate increases, and a lot of them challenging the process as well. So I think hirers taking that approach could find it more problematic.
Right. Will IR35 stop limited companies?
No, not at all. No, IR35 isn't changing. It's just the liability and the responsibility shifting. So there is no change to the way that IR35 is assessed. It's based on 20 years of case law and completing the correct tests. I think what will happen is it will probably change the way that contractors work and engage. I think at the moment they've got a choice where if they're outside of IR35, they can work through the limited company. If they're inside, they need to work through a PAYE solution like Umbrella. And I think that it will change the way that they engage with those types of models because they're likely to have roles that fall inside and outside of IR35 within a 12-month period. Ourselves, we've launched a new product called Flex, that actually lets people move between those two products and allows them the flexibility to be able to switch between umbrella and limited company while still pulling the tax returns together at year end as well.
Great. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, so for the next set of questions, we're looking at questions that start with how. And the first question is, how do I complete an IR35 audit?
Okay, so an IR35 audit is essentially trying to establish whether a particular contract is one of an employment relationship or not. So to do that, there's two things you need to be looking at really. One is what's written in the contracts. Typically, there might be two contracts to look at: contract between end client and agency, and contract between agency and PSC. So you need to have a look through those and look around the employment status tests. Second thing is just to make sure that those contracts are actually being performed in practice in line with the contract. So you need to look at the working practices. That's looking around how you engage and treat contractors in your organisation. One of the big changes as a result of the April 21 shift in liabilities, this is now an end hirer led audit. So it needs to be the end hirer that's looking at the way that they treat and manage workers rather than the previous approach, which was a contractor doing that. You should come to the same output, but it's the end hirer risk now, and all the information's in the possession of the end hirer. So that's one of the big switches we're going to see as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Matt. So the second one is, how long does an IR35 audit take?
Okay. So as I've described before, you need to be getting into the ins and outs of the working practices. You need to be reviewing contracts. So to review one individual contract could take half an hour, could take an hour. To review the working practices, again, could be half an hour, could be an hour. So relatively quickly to do the actual audit. I think to get the best outcome, you really need to think about who's undertaking that audit, what knowledge do they have, the access to information in the business, but also how can they apply the case law that relates to IR35. So it shouldn't take long to actually do an audit, but it's getting all the ducks in a row and getting the right professional advisors and the right internal knowledge lined up. And that's where the time and investment needs to be taken now, I think, just to make sure you've got it all teed up correctly. And then you should be able to whiz through those audits pretty quickly.
Great, thanks, Matt. And the third question, unusual, how to stop IR35?
Unsurprised that that's a high search term in Google. So I think we've covered before. I don't think we're going to stop the legislation changes. Maybe the question is, how do you stop IR35 impacting? So how do you prevent an inside IR35 status? So for me, that's around the engagement being not one of employment. So that needs collaboration really between everyone in the supply chain, just to think through, what am I buying here? If I'm buying time and materials and I want to control that individual and I want to specifically pick that individual, not allow anyone else to cover the project, then you're starting to look towards IR35 applying. If this is a statement of work, fully outsourced service with appropriate risk and financial penalties, and you've got a bit of flexibility around who you're going to use, and you're not willing to control them too much, particularly in what the contractor's doing and how they're doing it, then you're starting to move towards an outside IR35. There's no silver bullet to this, I'm afraid. It is about understanding and applying those employment status tests to each contract. Okay, in the final section, I'm going to ask Paul some questions around, is IR35? So first one, Paul, is IR35 good or bad?
It's a really unusual question. I suppose it depends on what lens you're looking through. I think the legislation, when it was originally brought in back in 2000, was brought in for the right reasons. It was to stop non-compliance and to identify where people weren't paying the correct amount of tax. I think the question around whether it's good or bad probably means around the changes that are coming in. And again, it's probably not a bad thing in terms of it being the client's responsibility to make the assessment. They have no vested interest in terms of how that contractor should get paid. The contractor making their own assessment, clearly they have financial gains out of answering the questions in a certain way to be outside of IR35. So I suppose the least biased person in that supply chain is the client. So putting the responsibility with them is probably a good thing overall. The difficulty is that we've seen over the last 3 years now that these changes aren't implemented properly, and clients take or don't take the right advice, don't go and get external specialists to look at this for them, and sometimes take a blanket approach, which isn't good. So I suppose whether it's good or bad, again, probably depends on what lens you're looking through, but I think it's a good thing as long as people do it in the right way and take reasonable care in their assessments.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks. Is IR35 the end of contracting?
No, definitely not. And something that a lot of people ask or talk about or write things on. I think this is definitely not the end of contracting. There's been multitudes and lots of different iterations of different legislation over the past 30, 40 years that have affected the flexible workforce as a whole. I think, and over that time, people have said this will be the end of contracting. It certainly isn't. Flexible working is one of the fastest growth areas in the UK industry. The UK massively relies on flexible workers. And I definitely don't think this is the end of contracting. Similar to the question earlier, I suppose, will this stop limited companies? No, it won't. The ones that are genuinely outside of IR35 will be able to continue working that way. Mentioned on a previous question that the way that IR35 is assessed hasn't changed. It's just the person responsible. So similar to what you said, Matt, I think people working collaboratively, working with the supply chain and taking reasonable care in their assessment, then this shouldn't have any impact in terms of future contracting opportunities.
Yeah. Final question, is IR35 liability changing?
Yes, it is. And I think you've answered this on a previous one as well, Matt, in terms of what's changing. The liability at the moment currently sits with the director of the limited company. It's their responsibility and liability if they get the assessment wrong. That's going to change from the implementation date from April 2021. Once the legislation comes in, the liability will sit with the fee payer. So the legislation uses that terminology and does clarify that in terms of the entity in the supply chain that's closest to the PSC, so the person paying them. Normally it's the recruitment agency, hence why we've spent so long advising recruitment agencies on the risk of IR35 and making sure they get that right. And similar to what you said again, Matt, is that the whole supply chain working together can make sure that they reduce that risk and mitigate that possible liability.
Okay, some interesting questions thrown out there by Google. Hopefully our responses make sense and help. If you've got any further questions or want to touch base with anyone in the Brookson team, feel free to contact us. Thanks for watching.
Thanks so much.